Hey guys, MetalJesus here, and today I'm very excited to share with you my entire Atari 2600 game collection. The original Atari was my first gaming love. It's what created this lifelong obsession I have with video games. And so because of that, I'm very excited to share with you some of my favorite games on the system. I'm going to talk about some of the common games, maybe some of the little hidden gems, as well as share with you some of the more collectible games on the original Atari. So if you've ever had any interest in the original Atari, this is the video for you. Let's take a look. Now, before we get started, I do want to let you know that I have about 160 games for the original Atari, so I can't really go over every single one of them, but I've kind of grouped them together, and we're going to go pretty fast. Once you start collecting for the original Atari, you'll notice that most of the time you'll actually find the cartridges loose. The vast majority of my collection actually is loose cartridges like you see here. And what's crazy about that is that there's no standard size or shape. Now, obviously, you can find some of the games in their original boxes, but it's generally few and far between because they were cardboard and they're getting very old now. And so what I've done for my collection is use the website miniboxgaming.com to get these replica boxes for most of my collection. I've done this with other collections that you guys have seen. I've done this with my Super Nintendo, my N64 collection, my Game Boy Advance collection. You guys have seen these in a lot of my videos, and so that's what you're gonna see here. And I do like them a lot. They do a great job, and they're perfect size. So yes, they don't have the manuals, but that's okay. They still make these loose cartridges, I think, look more presentable, and they look great on a shelf. Now, when it comes to the original Atari, when I was a little kid, my mom got the machine, and these were a lot of the original games that you got at the time, made and published by Atari for their console. There wasn't yet a lot of third-party games, at least that's kind of my memory of it. These right here were the games that I had growing up, and I gotta be honest, like, these were amazing at the time because back in the day, you know, when I was a little kid, the only place where you could play video games before the Atari was at the arcade. And while these games obviously don't look as good as the arcade counterpart, you have to understand back in the late 70s and early 80s, it didn't matter. This was as good as it got, and it was awesome at the time. And I mention that because I think looking back now, especially younger gamers than me probably see these as a little bit really simplistic, and that might be true. However, third-party companies came along, and you're going to see that really started pushing the envelope with the hardware, and in my opinion actually started making even better games for the system. But these games right here, I have some great nostalgia for this. I mean, a smile comes over my face when I see the box for the original Defender or Missile Command or Berserk, and I still think these games right here are a lot of fun. Missile Command in particular was translated over to the Atari really well. It's amazing because the arcade game, you actually used a trackball, and then on the Atari, you use a joystick. And I have to say, I actually prefer the joystick for some reason. It just feels a little bit more precise. And Berserk was another game that translated over to the Atari extremely well. It's missing some of the iconic voices from the arcade game, but all of the really fun gameplay is here. The other two games I want to mention is Super Breakout and Warlords. Those are two games that use the paddle controllers, and there is some precision here, and it feels really good. Again, these games are still fun today. By the way, something that doesn't get mentioned very often that was really cool at the time was that Atari started putting out Atari Force comic book. These were real comic books that came packed in games like Defender and Berserk and Star Raiders, and they were made by DC. This is an example of building hype around games. And oh man, again, as a kid, because I was in the comics as well, this was super neat. And so if you're going to start collecting for Atari, in my mind, Atari Force comic is a big part of that, and you should definitely consider trying to find them as well. I always thought these Telegames cartridges were pretty neat because they really advertise just how many variations of the game are included on that cartridge. I remember as a kid trying to use that as a tactic to get my mom to buy me a cartridge, because I could say, oh look mom, it's gonna have 27 games on one cartridge. That's such a deal. I mentioned how a lot of the cartridges might be different in their shape and size. Well, the same is definitely true when it comes to the box art, which can be kind of confusing when you are collecting. Just know that as the years went on, Atari themselves, as well as other companies, started changing the way that they made their boxes look. And so sometimes you'll see the same game, but maybe with a slightly different cover. So it can be kind of weird. Here's some more games I enjoy playing, including Phoenix, Galaxian, and Vanguard. Those are 3 shooters that I still enjoy playing today. And then you have Moon Patrol. Moon Patrol was one of my favorite arcade games as a kid, and admittedly, playing it on the 2600 looks kind of bizarre. The graphics are nowhere near as good as the arcade version. However, surprisingly, the gameplay is actually pretty good on the Atari. This game is much better than you would expect. It's funny looking back because I remember Centipede and Millipede being very popular in the arcades, and I remember being excited to try to play them on the home console. But honestly, I'm not a big fan of those games. I think they're just okay. However, it was Jungle Hunt that I was obsessed with for quite a while. I think as a kid, I just liked the idea of going on this big, grand jungle adventure. It's probably not the best game, but I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I used to love it. These are pretty trippy as well. I remember having a couple as a kid, and I thought they were pretty cool. So they are double-ended cartridges. They have 2 games on them, and depending on what end you insert into the Atari is the game that you'll get. I don't think that there were a lot of these, but they are pretty cool when you find them. Now, I mentioned how much I loved the actual Atari published games, and they were certainly great, but in my mind, both now and as a kid, I think it was Activision that blew the original Atari wide open and made it just an excellent machine. Activision in many ways worked miracles on that very simple hardware and made some of the best games. And they are still some of my most favorite gaming memories, and also even the most fun games to play today. I like how their cartridges and their boxes had their own distinct style to them. That was very cool, and they stand out as well. You guys know me and that I love arcade racing games, and part of that passion comes from the game Enduro that Activision released all those years back on the Atari. It's incredibly simplistic today, and obviously, you know, surpassed in many ways by many different games. And like so many other games in this video, I just have a soft spot. It was one of those games that really ignited that passion for car racing. Frostbite is a game that I didn't have as a kid, but I discovered many years later. And now I think it actually is one of the more fun games from Activision at the time. It's a game that takes the idea of Frogger and injects just enough new kind of tactics and strategy that it makes it a lot of fun. If you haven't played Frostbite, you definitely should. It's very addictive. You can't talk about Activision on the Atari without at least mentioning the 2 Pitfall games that came out for this. Now, it's funny because as much as I love the original Pitfall, I wasn't obsessed with it until the second one came out. Pitfall 2 took what was great about the original game and made it even better. But more importantly, because the entire level was mapped out and static, it felt like a real place. The original Pitfall game feels very generic. Again, don't get me wrong, it's a masterpiece and obviously a huge piece of gaming history, but I do think that Pitfall 2 is the better game. And you guys know that I love my shooters, and part of that passion for that comes from River Raid all those years ago. What I liked about it is that it was a unique experience to the Atari at the time. It wasn't based on a specific game in the arcades. It felt like it was designed specifically for the home console, and it still holds up today. When I plug in my Atari and I'm going to play for a couple hours, River Raid will always get some time. Chopper Command is a curious one. I love and I hate this game. It's kind of like Defender, but it's got its own kind of vibe going on. I love it because it's fun and addictive. I don't like it because it is really hard. I also want to mention Kaboom. Now, Kaboom is a curious one because at the time as a kid, I thought it was really hard and I didn't play it that much. However, as an adult, I actually really like this game a lot. I think I'm a little bit better at it for some reason. I'm not sure why. However, there's something you need to know about Kaboom if you're going to be trying to play this via emulation, and that is it is really, really difficult, almost broken to play this game if you try to use a joystick or a modern controller. This is a game that is dialed in for those paddle controllers on the Atari. If you're struggling with this game, trying to run it on emulation on a PC or on a handheld or something like that, anything other than a real Atari with real paddle controllers, that's the reason why. Try it on an actual machine. It's going to be no surprise to anybody who's been watching my channel for a while now. My ultimate favorite game on the original Atari is Hero by Activision. I was obsessed with this game as a kid, and I still think it's a very, very good game today. When you look at the original Atari and some of the games that came out for it in the beginning, like Combat and Tennis and some of these games that were fairly simple, and then you look at this game, which is basically like a platforming game, you know, an exploration game, an adventure game. It's amazing what they were able to pull off on that simple hardware. Now, there was a time when Hero was a cheap game. I remember distinctly going into retro gaming stores in the Seattle area and buying a cartridge loose for $5. And I did that because I wanted to have a backup. I was like, well, if my other cartridge fails, I got a backup. I only paid $5. And that led into an obsession of me trying to get every version of the game that it came out on. So you see that right here. While I like the Atari 2600 version, I also really like the Commodore 64 version. You see the Atari 8-bit version there, Atari 5200. The only one I'm actually missing is a really weird version that came out on the Sega SG-1000. Which transitions me into sharing my most valuable Atari 2600 games. Now, I had assumed it was going to be Hero, but it turns out it is this curious little game called Boing, which is very, I think, uncommon, especially to have the box and the manual. It's not obviously in great shape, but it's still really cool to have in my collection. I don't think many people actually even know about it. As of its value, it fluctuates a lot, and currently it's sitting around $800. As for number 2, this brand new sealed copy of Hero in the box. Now, this was given to me by a friend many years ago, and it wasn't that valuable back then, but over the years, obviously many games have gotten more expensive, and this unopened copy of it goes for around $750, sometimes up to $800. And I tell you what, you know, people ask me what games would I save from a fire. This is one of them. This is a game that I hope to have forever. I don't plan to ever sell it. The next two most valuable are part of the StarPath Supercharger collection. This is a series of very unusual games because they came out not on cartridge, but on audio cassette. And the reason why they did that is because it was kind of a workaround. So, you know, the original Atari was a pretty simple, primitive machine. However, if you put games on audio cassette, then suddenly you had more storage, and I believe the device actually even added more RAM to the system, at least while it's plugged in. But as you might expect, games on cassette, you know, they're pretty weird. Most people didn't even know that was a thing. And so the games Party Mix and Rapid Transit are some of the more collectible in this right here. Not crazy amount of money, usually they go for a couple $100. And this one really surprised me, a complete copy of Montezuma's Revenge. Again, a game I really liked as a kid. and all these decades later is suddenly very collectible, kind of hard to find, in great shape. I've had mine since I was a kid, which brings me to the sponsor of this video, because I used the app to determine exactly which games were valuable in my Atari collection, and that of course is the CLZ Games app. I've been using this app to catalog my games for a long time, and one of the great things about it is that it connects to the price charting website, and basically when you enter a game in there, it'll tell you what the value is. But the great thing about it actually is it updates as well. And so while I've added these games several years ago, it keeps the value updated, which is kind of nice, you know? And then in the app, you can sort by value, and you can sort either by the most valuable or the least valuable, which can be very handy if you are thinking of doing a trade. You know, I'm not always looking at the value of every game in my collection, but sometimes it's nice to know what games aren't really worth that much, or maybe ones that, yeah, you know, maybe you can trade away. I've been using the CLZ Games app for many years now, paying for my own subscription. And if you want to check it out, you can definitely find that app in the Google and Apple App Store. And I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. I mentioned Activision as making some of the best games on the Atari, but just barely below them, I would also say iMagic is extremely good as well. They are another third-party company that put out some of the best Atari games. Again, a company that really knew how to use that hardware to the maximum and create some really fun and interesting games. The best example for a lot of gamers like me is Demon Attack. When Demon Attack came out, there were a lot of these kind of shooters like this, these kind of vertical shooters that were trying to be like Galaxian or Phoenix. But in my mind, I actually think that Demon Attack was probably the best of the bunch. Also, Star Voyager was a really fun kind of Star Raiders-like game. You know, it's kind of like a space adventure game. This was at a time when I was obsessed with Star Wars and Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica, and this game definitely tapped into all of that. Another iMagic game that I was really obsessed with as a kid was Cosmic Arc, which is basically just like a four-way shooter, but it's got some really cool nuance to it. It's got a couple different variations. Again, a really fun game to play even today. I also like how they had a very distinctive style to their box art. It was that kind of shiny look to it. I think Demon Attack being the best example of this, and in my mind just being so iconic. Next on my list of favorite third-party publishers would have to be Parker Brothers. I owned a ton of these Parker Brothers games as a kid, and I think the surprising thing was, again, just how much quality they were, especially for licensed games, right? You know, even back then, I think we thought that licensed games are crap, but I don't know, man. The Empire Strikes Back on the Atari is really good. Later on in the 80s, Atari started changing the boxes yet again. You started seeing these dark red or maroon colored boxes. A few of these are re-releases, but for the most part, they're brand new games designed for the Atari, and you could tell that Atari themselves was starting to get better performance or more interesting games out of the system. These are some of the better games to play, in my opinion, at least from Atari themselves. I specifically really appreciated the release of Junior Pac-Man, because the original Pac-Man that was put out on the Atari back when I was in the 4th grade was absolute crap. I hated that version. And so it was really nice to see Atari several years later put out what I think is actually a much better version of a Pac-Man game, and so it's nice to have that. Another standout is the game Solaris, which at the time looks almost like an NES game, which is kind of amazing for such a primitive console like the Atari. But the developers were able to push the hardware, and Solaris is a really cool space exploration combat game. Again, looks light years better than anything that came out, you know, probably 10 years before that. Here are some of the Coleco games that I have, and I always thought it was really interesting that Coleco had their own competitor. They had the ColecoVision console, right, which was technically more powerful, a little bit newer, but they couldn't ignore the fact that the Atari was just everywhere. Everybody had one, so they had to try to put their games on that system as well. And it's wild to think that Coleco was the publisher of Nintendo's Donkey Kong on the Atari. Wow. Here's some more third-party games that, again, I love the covers on this. So obviously focusing a little bit more on the covers here because they were so colorful. They were so inviting. Again, as a little kid, man, you'd see these covers, you'd be like, wow, I want that game just based solely on that. But that's also what's daunting about the Atari. I remember talking to Rick Weiss, who is a massive Atari collector, and he's also part of the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. And I don't think anybody knows exactly how many Atari games were ultimately released. The official number listed on Wikipedia is 520 games, but it seems like every couple years or so, there's some new discovery made, and there's like a 1 or 2 off game that comes out that maybe was sold in the back of a magazine that people completely forgot about. So it can be kind of daunting to collect for it, especially if you're going to go for a complete collection. But I'll tell you what, one of my favorite things about the Atari is that when I go into a retro gaming store and I look in the Atari section, inevitably I will see maybe 1 or 2 games that I've never seen before in there. And usually, again, they're pretty cheap. But that's not where the Atari story ends, not by a long shot. You see, the homebrew community for the original Atari is one of the most exciting aspects of collecting for this system. Originally, the Atari was considered very difficult to program for, but over the decades, it seems like new tools, new instructions, and also new hardware has really opened up the possibilities of what that system can do. New homebrew games that are made for the Atari are some of the most exciting aspects of collecting for it. And in many ways, those games are actually some of the best that have ever been made for it. And you see a bunch of them here. Again, they're limited in how they can create graphics on the Atari, but trust me, the gameplay themselves actually is really taking advantage of decades of programming knowledge, as well as cheaper RAM. You know, that was one of the big aspects that really limited the Atari back in the day. And now, obviously, RAM is super cheap. And so some of these games are taking advantage of that. I've mentioned them before, but AtariAge.com is the website that you want to go to and at least check out, because it seems like every year they are putting out brand new homebrew games for the Atari. And I am a sucker for all of them. Usually they come with the boxes, the manuals. They're beautiful and they're just really fun to play. I do want to mention one of the most famous homebrew games for the original Atari. That is Halo 2600. This homebrew game was made by Ed Freeze, who worked at Microsoft and helped make the original Xbox. And when he left Microsoft, he asked Bungie and also Microsoft if they would give him permission to put out Halo 2600. I guess he wanted to challenge himself and kind of get back to his roots a little bit. So obviously it's a very primitive game, but also very cool. Some more homebrew games in the collection. The first one being Space Rocks. That was actually one of the first ones that I ever got when I discovered that actually Atari Age was publishing all of these brand new games, and Space Rocks is a really cool kind of updated version of Asteroids. You also have Star Castle, which was a game that I barely remember playing in the arcades, but again, now you have the Atari version, as well as Aardvark. I love the game Aardvark. I've mentioned before that Sierra back in the day put out a kind of clone of that called Oil's Well. Very addictive. And then here's some more I've picked up over the years, including Super Cobra Arcade, Draconian, you have Mappy, you also have Wall Jump Ninja, and just a bunch more. And that's why I wanted to mention homebrew on the Atari, because yes, there were obviously hundreds of retail releases, but really the most exciting part of collecting for the Atari is when you jump into homebrew. Many of the best designed and best games on the Atari are actually games that were released in just the last 5 or 10 years. And so I really want to stress that if you are thinking about jumping into collecting for the Atari or playing games on the Atari, you're definitely going to want to check out some of the better homebrew games on there. You're going to be blown away. Another person who's very passionate about creating new homebrew games for the Atari is my good buddy, the immortal John Hancock. Every couple years, he'll work with a developer and a designer to create a new game that he can sell at expos. But he goes the extra mile and he throws in a bunch of goodies in there as well. It really reminds me of what they used to do with big box PC games. And so that, guys, is a quick look at my entire Atari 2600 game collection. And like I mentioned, it is definitely a work in progress. While I don't consider myself actively hunting or looking for games for the system, like I said, when I go in a retro gaming store or I go to a retro gaming expo, I will always look to see if there is a loose cartridge of a game I've never heard of, and yeah, I buy it. Because for me, it was my first love. It's the thing that got me passionate about video games, and when I look at it, I get all misty-eyed. It's awesome. I love it. And so thank you very much, guys, for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.